Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a la presentación del 10º libro de la editorial Diente de León, titulado Armonía, una nueva forma de ver el mundo, y escrito por el Príncipe de Gales, con coautoría de Tony Juniper e Ian Skelly, quienes nos acompañan hoy en la presentación y a quienes han visto en este momento hablar. Soy Ana de Azcárate, fundadora y directora de la editorial Diente de León. En la editorial publicamos libros sobre ecología y salud, y organizamos eventos de formación con nuestros autores. Armonía, una nueva forma de ver el mundo, es un libro que abarca muchos temas: filosofía, literatura, música, medio ambiente, urbanismo, alimentación, salud. Pero la idea central del libro gira en torno al medio ambiente y la necesidad de tomar conciencia y acciones para la conservación y permanencia de nuestro planeta. Para recuperar la armonía, sostiene el Príncipe de Gales, hay que escuchar y observar a la naturaleza, conectar, y por otro lado, beber de la tradición, de nuestro pasado, de cómo vivieron nuestros abuelos, para así poder encontrar las claves para construir un futuro mejor. Llegamos a este libro en el 2017 a través de la Sustainable Food Trust, que es una organización que promueve sistemas de alimentación sustentable, que organizaron una conferencia titulada Harmony in Food and Farming, que exploró las formas en que los principios de la armonía se manifiestan en la alimentación, la agricultura, el medio ambiente, la educación, la salud y la música. Y toda la conferencia giraba en torno a este libro. Al ver el impacto que Armonía generó en el Reino Unido, consideramos imprescindible traducirlo para su divulgación en español. Estamos aquí hoy en esta videoconferencia con los coautores Ian Skelly y Tony Juniper para que nos cuenten el impulso inicial por el cual escribieron este libro, las motivaciones del Príncipe de Gales, y pero que nos ubiquen en contexto y nos digan qué podemos hacer para buscar la armonía en todas las esferas de la vida. Voy a presentar a Ian. Ian Skelly es escritor, presentador de televisión, especializado en música clásica. Tiene más de 20 años trabajando con el Príncipe de Gales y hace unos años se encargó de la producción del guión documental Harmony, del cual acaba de hablar, basado en el libro y realizado por NBC Televisión de Estados Unidos. Ian nos va a hablar sobre las motivaciones y el trasfondo filosófico por las cuales el Príncipe Carlos escribió este libro. Por otro lado, Tony Juniper, que es un reconocido ambientalista y escritor, destaca su trabajo. Trabajó muchos años en Friends of the Earth, que es una organización inglesa, pero actualmente preside Natural England, que es la agencia oficial de conservación de la naturaleza del gobierno británico, y es asesor ambiental del Príncipe de Gales. Es autor de un bestseller que es súper alucinante, que se llama What Has Nature Ever Done for Us? ¿Qué ha hecho la naturaleza por nosotros? Y Tony hoy nos va a hablar de la crisis ambiental, del problema de la forestación, de la pesca, de economía circular y qué podemos hacer todos para ayudar con el equilibrio del medio ambiente. Espero que esta presentación sea motivadora y que, por supuesto, aquí está el libro, les anime a comprar el libro y nos pueden seguir en Instagram y en nuestra web, y allí encontraréis toda la información sobre nuestros libros y talleres. Gracias, Ian. Gracias, Tony. Thank you por estar aquí, por hacer la presentación. Gracias a Natalia, quien nos asiste hoy en la interpretación, y a todos vosotros por estar aquí. Ian, if you want to, you can start now. So,
thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, Anna. Yes, it's a big book. This, it takes quite a lot of reading. It covers a lot of different subjects. And that was really the reason why the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, wanted to write this book. I'd known him for a number of years, and I've helped him to write a number of his big speeches that he's given at COP conferences, his speeches that he's given in the United States of America and in the United Kingdom. And by the time I got to know him, he was well known in the United Kingdom for being very concerned about a whole range of different subjects. Agriculture, the way we treat the earth, the way we rear our food was a very big issue that he'd spoken out about. Architecture, the way we design and build the places that we live in, and indeed also the way in which we design the urban environments in which we live. He was very concerned about the state of forestry, particularly rainforests, and he was concerned about the way in which we seem to be fishing the oceans empty of fish. He was also very concerned about healthcare and how that is approached in hospitals. And ultimately, he was also very concerned about the entire way in which the global economies operate. And all of these different subjects seem to be very separate. And he was often criticized for therefore bothering here and then bothering there and not really talking about just one thing. And so what he wanted to do was to demonstrate that all of these different subjects are actually all connected, and they're all connected by the same set of rules. And the reason that he wanted to call this book Harmony, Armonía, is because that's an ancient Greek word, which essentially means to join things up. So the ancient Greeks would talk about a building being harmonic because it was joined up. It didn't fall down. It didn't collapse. It was well constructed. It held together. And he realized that that's how nature operates. It is a harmonic system. Every one part of the natural system is connected to every other part. Every one part of the natural system is dependent upon everything else. Nothing lives in isolation. And the main thrust of the first part of this book is to say that over the past 200, possibly 300 years, because of the way that Western thought has gone, we have tended to stop operating like that. We have tended to start to think of ourselves as being disconnected from the rest of the natural world. And we've tended to see elements of the natural world as being disconnected from everything else. So, you know, it's quite reasonable with this mindset to chop down thousands of trees in the rainforests and not imagine that that will have a consequence thousands of miles away. What we're now seeing, of course, is that it does. If you do wipe out the rainforests, you wipe out the lungs of the earth. You wipe out the capacity of the earth to produce gallons upon gallons of rainwater that feeds land thousands of miles from the rainforests on which we grow food. So if you chop trees down in the rainforest, you affect you. You affect your well-being. And that really was the main point of this book, to demonstrate that everything is interconnected and that we are not just part of a natural system. It goes much more, much deeper than that. As the Prince says very clearly in the book, if you describe yourself as being a part of the natural system, you are still describing yourself as an element that's separate from the rest of it. What we really need to do is rethink our entire view of where we are in the natural system and understand that we are nature. We are as much nature as a bird or a fish or a plant. And within us, there are organisms without which we cannot survive. And so it's a much more profound relationship we have with nature than we've been led to believe we have with nature. And that really is the central philosophical point of this book. What the Prince wanted to define was what he called a crisis in our perception. we have economic crises, we have environmental crises, but ultimately he would argue we are suffering from a crisis in our perception, how we perceive our place in the world and how we perceive even the world itself, how it operates and what we see nature being. And within the book, I mean, this is 10 years ago now, he was arguing points which I must say are now in the mainstream, when 10 years ago they weren't. Ideas like the fact that trees over a great period of a great distance are connected. They do communicate with others. They help each other, and other organizations help them too. Now, this might sound a bit wacky to say, a bit strange to say, but that's a form of consciousness, that life is conscious. There are different levels of consciousness. I suppose we would say we're at the top of the consciousness tree. Maybe whales, dolphins might disagree with that, but there is consciousness at work, and that is also part of nature, and that we have to bring that element of our lives, what you might call the sacred or the spiritual, the instinctive and the conscious aspects of life, into our thinking about the way that we operate in the world. Because I think it's pretty clear that we can't solve the massive environmental problems that the world now is clearly suffering by carrying on as we always have done for the past 200 years. We know, for example, that motor cars emitting carbon dioxide creates this cushion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which, like any cushion or duvet or sheet on a bed, enables the air to heat up, and that creates global warming. We know that happens. We can't solve global warming by carrying on driving cars as much as we did. It just won't solve the problem. So he wanted to get those points across. He wanted to get across the point that you're not going to solve the massive problem in agriculture that there is now of great acres of completely depleted soil if you carry on farming the way that the Western world has increasingly farmed. If you just pour pesticides and herbicides and indeed artificial fertilizers onto the ground, then you succeed in depleting the soils. And remember, around the world, there's a depth of soil probably about this much, which we are all dependent on. We're all dependent on about 6 inches of topsoil. And in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime, in the past 50 years, we've depleted somewhere in the region of 1/3 of all farmable soil by this industrialized approach to agriculture. It is not sustainable. We have to think of a different way of operating. And the Prince of Wales's argument is that if you simply look at the way nature works, all of the answers are kind of there. Nature does not operate on a linear, straight line basis. Nature operates on a circular basis. And if you adopt circular approaches to economics or agriculture, or indeed urban design, it is surprising the results that you get. So in the book, you'll find a rather odd and interesting chapter on geometry, mathematical geometry. We go into it in quite some detail, hopefully in a way that's easily understandable. There are lots of diagrams to help you with that because it is a very visual subject. And the geometry that the Prince wanted to demonstrate was the geometry that you find everywhere in nature. The patterns of growth that you see when you watch a rose growing, the way that the plant divides and grows, the way in which you grow. When you're born, you don't have any teeth. then you get 1, then you get 2, then you get 3, then you have 5, then you have 8, then you have 13. This is a famous pattern of growth called the Fibonacci sequence. And the ancient cultures of the world spotted this thousands of years ago. And if you draw out the geometry that dictates how a flower develops, you'll find it's the geometry that built the great Parthenon of the Greeks, or the wonderful mosques of the Islamic Empire, or the wonderful Gothic architecture of the Christian tradition. What these people were doing was taking the geometry of a flower and using that geometry to create their great buildings. And one suspects the reason they were doing that was a form of tribute to nature. And it was a reminder of how nature operates. And it was a way of placing humanity within the universe. So when, for example, you stand in the middle of a great Gothic cathedral, like, well, you can't at the moment, Notre Dame in Paris, but, you know, once upon a time, what you're doing there, it's standing within a concrete expression of how the universe is structured. It's an experience of being a part of the universe. And I don't know what the Spanish is for universe, but in English, universe means one verse. There is just one completely integrated system. It's why when, for example, you look at a beautiful stained glass window in a cathedral, notice that it is round, notice that there is a point at the center, and your eye will keep going back to the point of that center. Normally in a Christian cathedral, it is a symbol of Christ there. But what those windows are doing is demonstrating the relationship between this vast diversity of life in the world and its relationship to the whole. So that is why in the book as well, there's hopefully an interesting and also easy to understand explanation of some of the ancient philosophies of the world, the philosophies of the Hindu tradition, or the philosophy of the Islamic tradition, or the philosophy of the Christian tradition, and ultimately the philosophy of Plato. Plato's philosophy you could very easily describe as a philosophy of unity. There's a wholeness to life, and that is the philosophical basis of this argument, that we have to recognize that there is a wholeness to life, and that if we continue to ignore that fact, the more damage we do to one part of the whole, we do the damage to all of it. And of course, ultimately, we damage ourselves. So the Prince wanted to try and draw all of these different subjects together, demonstrating maybe the right ways to do things rather than the wrong ways to do things in agriculture, in architecture, in the way that you design urban spaces where you create what he calls walkable towns, again, based on the same geometry, where you don't necessarily need a motor car to go anywhere. You can walk places. You can be part of a community rather than stuck in some terrible, you know, skyscraper where it's very difficult for communities to cohere. And also that we must recognize within healthcare that the human body is not a machine as such. The psychology and the mind, the spiritual side of our lives is as much as important as it is the mechanical side of healthcare. And ultimately to argue that we need to recalibrate our entire economic model so that it better matches the way nature operates, that we create circular forms of economy rather than linear and totally exploitative and destructive forms of economy.
Thank you, Ian. Tony, I don't know if you want to continue.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was a brilliant summary,
Yes.
Ian, of the overall thesis of harmony. And I probably won't go on too long, because I think you've covered it so brilliantly, but just to reinforce maybe one or two points that I think are really crucial in terms of the value of this book. And so one thing for me, having worked in the sustainability and environmental realm for many, many years, is the extent to which the discussion is generally one about policy choices. It's about international agreements. It's often about science and the level of proof we've got about global warming. And then very often the discussion is also about technology and moving from fossil fuels to renewables or to electric vehicles, for example. But this book made a completely different contribution to all of that, in the sense that it is a philosophy book, as Ian has very ably described. And, you know, it's about the nature of reality and about the nature of knowledge. It's about guiding principles for how we approach big problems. And it's also about understanding of some really fundamental things that, you know, shape our day to day, but which often are quite invisible to people. And so this idea of taking sustainability from a series of technical questions about how you stop deforestation, or how you do sustainable agriculture, or how you might reduce emissions, and putting it into that much more profound space, I think is an incredibly important contribution. And I don't know, Ian, if you've read anything over the years which would be in a similar space, but actually I struggle to think of anything that comes close to what His Royal Highness did with this book. And it was certainly an education for me, being a co-author, bringing many years of expertise from the environmental and sustainability side, but uniting that with the thesis that His Royal Highness put together really was adding an awful lot of value. And so it's 14 years, isn't it, since we began work on this book. And, you know, the world has shifted very considerably since then. And, you know, I remember vividly when we were doing the initial research, there were still climate change deniers going on the television and saying that we had nothing to worry about global warming because it wasn't true. And then there was the very low profile of the other major environmental issue, which actually potentially is even bigger than climate change and its implications and what it means for the future, namely the degradation of biological diversity and the loss of ecosystem function. That was nowhere to be seen. And both of these things now are in a very different place. And, you know, we have the climate change treaty from Paris, and then more progress made in Glasgow this year. And I do think this book helped to shape that discussion that ensued after it was published. And more importantly, perhaps, and even some of those sectoral pieces of progress that you can see evidence of sectoral progress on things like energy policy, you know, there's been a new discussion that's broken out in relation to, you know, the nature of the economy. Is it really sufficient to carry on seeking to maximize GDP and for all of our ills and our problems to disappear if we succeed in that? There's now an active discussion that's been building ever since Harmony was published. And I think Harmony contributed to this around the need to be looking more widely at the whole notion of natural capital and the extent to which the natural world actually sustains social and economic well-being. You know, it was the case not so long ago that people would assume that the destruction of nature, it was regrettable, but it was the inevitable price of progress. It was something we had to do to grow the economy. That discussion now has been shifted into a more productive place. We've got a long way to go. But I think the very idea of pointing out that there was this disharmony between economics and ecology, and the way the book did that in a very powerful way, but not only highlighting the problem, also being able to talk about solutions, including this notion of a circular economy, which mimics the loops and cycles of nature rather than the very linear way that we have become used to doing economics as a result of our industrial mindset which has emerged over the last couple of 100 years. And actually, this is something else the book does, as Ian was saying, which I think is very powerful, is to chart that history of ideas and the extent to which we haven't always thought like we do now, and how actually people centuries ago had some ideas that might be more fit for the future than the current way of looking at the basics of how societies function that we do today. So there's a great deal in there, but I would just emphasize the extent to which it complements a lot of other input to the sustainability discussion, the policy work, the science work, and all of these clever things that people are doing with digital technologies and everything else. That's all essential. But actually, we are not going to succeed in the revolution that's needed. And the Prince of Wales uses that word at the beginning of the book. We are not going to succeed with this sustainability revolution unless we shift the basic ways in which we see our place in the world. And as Ian said, with humankind, actually, we are nature. We're not separate from it. And that's a trap that we've fallen into through 2 centuries of science dominating the discussion at every level across Western societies. And actually just finish with one little remark about the Prince of Wales's views on science, because sometimes the media here suggest he's anti-science because he may raise concerns about genetically modified organisms, for example. But actually, he's never been anti-science and knows more about science than many scientists. But the point he's making is that science cannot answer all of our complex questions. We need to have a sense of the sacred, a sense of the philosophical, and to be taking a more broad and profound view than simply the answers you can get out of a computer and lots of data. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So after that wonderful presentation about the book and where are we right now, I would like, I'm going to speak Spanish. No sé si alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta. Si no, yo haría alguna. Si quieren encender su micrófono o encender la cámara. So maybe I'll start while people want to think about a question. I wanted to ask you about COVID and about, it's been 2 years now, and how that has changed, or if it in some way has, though it was a crisis and it really, has it changed our way of thinking about nature? Do you think people have, okay.
It should have done, and I think to some extent has done. There's a couple of levels to this, and actually Harmony touches on both of these subjects in different ways. And so, the dangers that arise from the way in which we have developed our relationship with nature, there are hazards that include the transfer of diseases from the natural world and into the human world. And there are several connections with that, which are covered in the book. So one is the excesses of factory farming, and the extent to which going down that route does lead to hazards in the human world, including antibiotic resistance and doing away with some of our most valuable drugs as a result of resistant bacteria developing in intensive animal farms, but also the ways in which that can foster the spread of novel viruses. And, in the news in recent years, we've seen swine flu and bird flu emerging from industrial poultry regimes, but there are other connections too, including those linked with deforestation and the repeated outbreaks of Ebola in West Africa during recent decades have been linked to people coming into contact with wild fruit bats in ways that they wouldn't have done had the forest still been standing and the animals had the space that they previously had. And then you look at the origin of AIDS in humans and the extent to which that was linked to bushmeat hunting and people catching gorillas and chimpanzees from the wild, leading to that virus transmitting into the human world. And then SARS in the early 2000s and how that came from wild animals being kept in restaurants, and then COVID-19 and the extent to which that was down to a transfer between wild creatures being kept in bad conditions in captivity, probably horseshoe bats and pangolins coming into contact in a way that they never would normally because of the way they were being trafficked, leading to the virus mutating and then jumping into humans. And so the Prince of Wales has been highlighting these kinds of connections for some time. And indeed, once this COVID-19 pandemic began, he did begin making those kinds of points. And so our relationship with nature, getting into the bad place that it's got to now, has many hazards linked with it: food security, water security, resilience from climate change, and yes, pandemics. And then on top of that, the other connection, which is very much covered in Harmony, is the extent to which we gain great psychological and physical health benefits from being in contact with the natural world, and the idea of biophilia, which was first described by the great scientist Edward Wilson, but which was included as part of the narrative in Harmony, about the extent to which we naturally connect with the natural world because we are nature. And this shouldn't come as any kind of a surprise. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was in this country, and I don't know if it was the same in Spain, but when the shops were closed, people couldn't go to restaurants, the cinemas were shuttered up, people took solace in going outside into nature, and they found great benefits from being able to enjoy bird song, to be able to see rivers and lakes, to be able to hear the wind in trees. And this became something of a talking point in this country, and I think was something of a reawakening in the sense of people understanding that, yes, there's something here we've overlooked, it's been on our doorstep, but actually our relationship with nature is really important. And I think on both counts, actually, this has helped shape the post-COVID world, because after you have these kinds of economic shocks, history shows us that actually environmental ambition in politics and policy, it often goes down. But this time it hasn't so much. And I think in part it's because of those two reasons: understanding that actually our relationship with nature is what caused the problem. And then in coping with it, one of the things that helped us was being able to engage with nature.
Yeah, I feel completely what you said is what I think we felt here also. And I think many people went into nature because the isolation in the city was terrible. And yeah, the only way to actually, well, being able to feel healthy in such a crisis was actually going out from the city and being in nature. You both of you spoke about the fact agriculture and farming, and the fact that this we are depleting our soil, and we are the diversity that we used to have is no longer there. So what can we do as individuals? Because we don't control agriculture, do we? Do we control farming? Or how can we help in some way so to stop this and to promote a healthier way of agriculture and farming?
Well, I think we can make a difference because each and every one of us goes and buys food. And the choices that you make dictates what is produced. And I think, well, in this book, the Prince of Wales argues quite strongly that the consumer is an important element in this revolution. That if you buy in a certain way and you support a certain kind of agriculture, then the changes occur, and they have occurred. We are, I know, now facing severe economic problems around the world, and not helped by food supplies being disrupted because of the present conflict in Ukraine. And the cost of people's food bills are going up. But as the Prince has long argued, the reason why what you might call organic farming is more expensive than the more industrialized approach to farming is that a lot of the time, the subsidization of these different processes in farming is not level, that it's cheaper and more efficient to do bad things than it is to do good things. But if you calibrate the way in which subsidies operate, that could also, I think, help with the long-term help to create a more successful, sustainable form of agriculture. So I think the consumer has a big part to play in all of this, and indeed the producer as well. And you know, the educational institutions still in this country, in the United Kingdom, if you go to the major agricultural colleges, organic farming is still something seen in the main as being a fringe idea, not commercially viable. And yet now, because of the efforts of the Prince of Wales in the United Kingdom, there are more organic farms than there were 20, 30 years ago, proving that it is economically possible. So the shift has to come, I think, within the education system as well. But it is ultimately what we do as individuals that can make a very great difference. Tony, I would have thought you'd agree with that.
Yeah, definitely, Ian. Yeah, you know, the food piece is one. Another one is consumption generally. You know, I think most of us in Western countries probably, you know, we're not short of things, are we? I think if anything, most of us have got too much stuff cluttering up our houses. And so, you know, the idea of walking more lightly on the earth by consuming less, everybody can do that. I mean, plastic gets a high profile, but it's pretty much everything. Make things last, get beautiful things that serve some function. But this consumerism that's now utterly out of control, it's a conveyor belt to landfill, most of it. Utterly useless stuff being sold to people on a mass scale, creating massive greenhouse gas emissions, pollution and everything else. So think about all of that too. And the food piece, Ian has covered very well, but it's profound. If you're interested in the destruction of nature and stopping it in terms of deforestation and soil damage, food is the biggest single contribution everybody can make. The other thing I would add is if you have children or grandchildren, instead of taking them shopping, take them to your local nature reserve and walk them around and help them identify the birds. That's probably the biggest contribution you can make to the future in terms of shaping that understanding, that philosophical connection with nature that's now lacking. Because the main problem that this book describes in the end is, as Ian described, that crisis of perception. And that crisis of perception comes from disconnection. And that disconnection comes from an increasingly urbanized lifestyle, people getting into air-conditioned cars, going to air-conditioned offices, and then to an air-conditioned gym and then a supermarket, without any of it being connected to the reality of how this planet works. So taking young children outside and helping them understand that actually there is a set of underpinning processes going on, the web of life that basically is in which is suspended our civilization. This is quite an important thing for people to know, and most people don't know it. And so if you've got some youngsters you can help to see that, that's a big thing.
It is a very big thing. Do you know, I was in a small school the other day, a school for children between the ages of 5 and 11. And I was looking around the classroom and there was nothing but plastic. The tables, the chairs, all of the display units, all of the writing facilities, everything was made of plastic. There wasn't one piece of wood in this classroom. Now, if a child lives in that environment, that becomes the natural way to be. What would the difference be if they were using natural materials and living in an environment where they weren't quite so surrounded by plastic? I'm sure it would have a profound effect. I remember doing a talk in America some years ago on this book and these ideas of the Prince of Wales. And a woman came up to me afterwards and said how moving she'd found the talk. And she'd so wished that when she was a child, she could have done more walking. But in the place where she lived, it was rather difficult because they didn't have any sidewalks. They'd never put any into the town. You couldn't walk anywhere. So we built a world that kind of prevents us from being natural. And I think it would do us all a lot of good if we fought against that and just questioned what is seen to be the norm.
Exactly.
So going back on food, yes, so we do have a responsibility as consumers. But what I try to buy organic food. I try to go to my local farm and go to eco-organic stores. But the question always is, this is more expensive.
Well, this is this is the economics piece, because it isn't expensive. If you start to put in the costs that are going to be caused to present and future generations by the impacts of climate change, which in large part is being fueled by agriculture, then there's a big cost there. Soil damage in our part of the world in England is a major reason why people's houses are flooding after heavy rains, again linked to climate change, and that causes misery plus massive economic damage. The problem we have in terms of food availability across the world today, and not just in the West, but globally, is no longer a question of hunger, it's obesity, and that is costing the health service in different countries many billions of pounds. Indeed, I've seen figures suggesting that by 2050 in this country, the National Health Service might be spending about 40% of its budget dealing with weight-related illnesses, type 2 diabetes, for example. This is directly tracked back to the kinds of diets we have. Processed food, which is cheap in inverted commas, and still until you start to look at the cost in terms of taxes having to be spent on cleaning up the mess that industrial food system is making. So I would contest the idea that this food is expensive. Organic, produced in an ecological manner, that's the cheapest food we're going to get. And not only for us, but for future generations. When all that soil has gone that Ian was describing, what are people going to be eating then? Will it be more expensive to grow food? I think it probably will be. So taking care of the fundamentals of the natural system, looking after the pollinators, looking after soil health, being thoughtful about what the end effect of that food will be on public health and well-being. These are all big economic questions, but we don't ever see them. We just look at the end price in the supermarket, which is, I'm afraid, a highly misleading price, to put it mildly, in terms of the hidden economics of all of this. And, some people, they say, well, we need to end capitalism when they look at these kinds of economics. I say, actually, let's just put some honest numbers into capitalism and it would work very differently.
The Prince of Wales in the book calls this accounting for sustainability. And the whole idea is, as Tony was saying, that when you look at your business spreadsheet, the balance sheet, you include in your costs, the costs to the earth. I can't remember the actual figures now, Tony, but how much water does it take to produce of artificial fertilizer? It's
a
gallons and gallons of water,
and natural gas,
and lots of natural gas. That's never accounted for in the business accounts that you see in the supermarket checkout. So it's about including the costs to the earth, putting nature, as the Prince of Wales will put it, at the heart of the equation. At the moment, nature is excluded from that equation because it's convenient to do so. Well, convenient up to a point, but we are going to start, if we're not already, reaping the cost of ignoring those costs.
Exactly. There's some really interesting work going on these days in the realm of environmental economics, and one famous paper published a few years ago really does underline the point that we're both making right now. It basically looks at the contribution to the global economy annually coming from so-called ecosystem services. So the replenishment of water by rainforests, the capture of carbon in peatlands, soils recycling nutrients, protection of property from flooding and sea level rise, contribution of pollinating insects, all these kinds of things. If you add up the economic value of those, it's about $125 trillion per year. Meanwhile, global GDP is $75 trillion a year. So the bit of the economy that we're destroying and counting as growth is actually bigger than the bit that we're measuring and which we think is underpinning human welfare. It's the biggest confidence trick in human history, I think, that misperception. And again, this brings us back to what this book invites the readers to do, to understand the reality that we actually live in, rather than the fabrications that have come from modern economics and some elements of technology and science. If I can put it like that.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite clear. Ian, you spoke about circular economy instead of, the linear economy that it's the common. Could you stand on that? And do you think we also how can we contribute to that kind of economy if we can?
Well, there are lots of different examples of circular economies. I think there are a few listed in the book. One that comes to mind was a very large operation in the United States, where the straw from crops is used to create ethanol that is a replacement for gasoline or petrol as a fuel. And that is an example, it seems to me, of a circular economy, in the sense that the usual way in which ethanol is produced is that rainforests are chopped down and crops are produced to create this fuel. But if you use secondary waste products, just as nature does, then you're starting to create a circular effect rather than a linear one. You're not destroying anything, you're using something that's producing a fuel, which, by the way, doesn't produce the same amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. So, I mean, you can, it's about reusing rather than just throwing away. And you can look at any industry, and I imagine you can see where there are ways that you can turn the process into a circular economy.
Okay, so we are almost to the end, and no one has really asked anything, but just to sort of round up and finish this whole presentation. Oh, you want to ask something?
I want to do a question. I would like to know a bit more about the origin of the project. How did this book come about? Was the prince who contacted you, or how was the project?
Ian, you're probably best placed to answer that. I think you were involved slightly before me.
Well, it started in a very strange way, Natalia. The Prince of Wales got married to his wife, and at the marriage service, there was a piece of Russian Orthodox music which was performed. And the prince spoke to me afterwards and said how interested he was at the effect that this harmony had on people. It was a profoundly beautiful piece of choral music. And we started talking about harmony and how it works in music. I'm very interested in music. And that developed then into a bigger conversation about how it works in different ways. What are the origins of this word, as I explained at the beginning. And so we actually started by trying to put a few of these ideas into some small speeches that he gave, and slowly built up the proposition. in a way that hopefully made it accessible for people. So we did bigger speeches, and then eventually came the idea that maybe we could write an entire book. So in this very strange kind of way, if you're really looking for the seed of this, it was in a piece of music performed at his wedding, which is quite an extraordinary thing. But then I'm not qualified, as Tony is, on the real economics and the natural, the natural systems and the things we're doing to the world. So then the Prince said, we've got to get Tony in on this, because Tony, you were already working, I think, on the rainforest project.
Yes,
something you'd set up, and I think that's worth talking a little bit about, and indeed
it is.
what then followed, because what's happened since this book came out is quite remarkable. What the Prince has achieved.
Yes, it is. Yes, that's right, Ian. I was involved as an advisor with the Prince's Rainforests project, and had come there having been director of Friends of the Earth, and was in touch with him on various subjects where we had a very strong convergence of interest over the years, on climate change, on genetically modified crops and food and agriculture, and also the subject of rainforests. And that was running in parallel with us writing the book, and that was a successful project. It got rainforests onto the international agenda in the climate negotiations, but then led to a whole series of follow-up projects through the Prince's International Sustainability Unit, which very much used the Harmony thesis to be guiding the kinds of discussions that we were seeking to convene with governments, with the private sector, and others, to be able to make progress on some of these subjects. And more recently, the Prince has established his Sustainable Markets Initiative, rallying behind this idea of a Terra Carta, really a charter for the earth. And throughout all of these initiatives, you can see echoes of harmony. So, the ideas lived on in the work that he was doing, but also, it's right, isn't it, in a whole load of spin-off projects and initiatives that you can see that were inspired by the book, including a school near London, which changed its entire curriculum to be based on the principles of harmony. The Sustainable Food Trust, which is advocating for changes to agriculture, very much on the same page. People in the health realm using some of the ideas. So it's had quite an impact, I think, and some of it quite hard to track. It's a bit below the line, but I think the power of the ideas, they were quite infectious and remain so.
Well, yes, and another big area which we haven't really covered is urban design, which is covered in the book. Only last week, a very senior government minister in the United Kingdom was taken around one of the examples of the towns that the Prince has inspired. And it's very interesting that whereas even 10 years ago, a lot of his ideas were rejected by the British building industry as being too expensive or just ridiculous, are now becoming policy, and because they're being seen to be capable of producing townscapes that last longer. The buildings don't keep getting knocked down. They're townscapes that succeed in creating coherent communities rather than ghettos where people feel lost and without voice. And in fact, in Wales, in part of the United Kingdom, and also down in Cornwall, which is one of the most deprived parts of Britain, there are now new towns based upon these principles of the walkable town, and in Scotland too, and in Jamaica, and in China. So it's these ideas are out there and gaining traction and starting to be taken very seriously indeed by major players around the world.
Thank you.
And thank you.
I wanted to ask, just to kind of sum up and round up, what would be the 2, 3, 5 things that you would recommend to us as individuals for, for the harmony of the environment, for nature, basically to give our children and grandchildren a better place to live?
Well, I think I said my piece already, Anna. You know, be careful about what you buy, food-wise. Try to reduce your overall consumption of things. Cut back on energy use by walking and cycling and having your home made energy efficient, and invest in the next generation by getting these ideas understood yourself and then being able to share them with youngsters. I think that would be my top mix.
Yes, I think slow down is a big one for me, and it pays to look at the beauty of the world. It really does. Rumi, the Sufi poet who died 800 years ago, observed on one occasion that if you see a rose, then you are a rose garden. But if all you see is a thorn, then you're firewood. And it takes a bit of time to think about that. But in other words, if you look at the world and see it as a beautiful place, notice how connected it is, get your hands dirty in the soil, grow vegetables, grow flowers, listen to the music of the world. If you're more sensitive to it, you will be more in love with it. And it's very difficult to destroy something that you love. But if you're persuaded that, you know, you can do this without injuring the thing you love, then you're going to carry on. Well, you can't. You've got to take more care of your lover.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for giving all your knowledge today, for writing this book. I think it's amazing. I have enjoyed it a lot, being the editor of the book. So, gracias a todos por estar aquí, por haber contribuido con esta presentación. Los esperamos para nuestro próximo libro. Y bueno, buenas tardes. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for your time. And well, I hope to see you soon. I hope you can come to Madrid sometime. We like doing workshops with our authors, and it's a way of connecting with the readers in a more intimate way, and so people can get the knowledge of the book in another sense. So hopefully we can arrange some time for you, both of you, to come. Okay.
That'd be nice.
So good night.
Thank you. Adios.
Good luck. Ciao.